Hello, friends. It's good to have you here tonight. Tell me, where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? Late night, early morning, or maybe the middle of the day when you need something calm to drift away with? I always find it interesting, knowing that somewhere across the world, someone else is lying awake, listening to the same slow story about the forgotten corners of history. Tonight, we're going back, far back, to a place of stone and shadow, of incense and smoke, of whispers between gods and men, to the beating heart of the Roman world. And through one man's eyes, we will see what it meant to heal in an age when medicine was half science, half superstition, and when every breath might still belong to the gods. His name was Marcus Aurelius Licinius, a physician in the city of Rome, though not a grand one. Not a man of marble halls or imperial service, but a quiet doctor whose hands were always scented with herbs and oil, whose robe sleeves were darkened with the stains of healing. He lived on the slope of the Esquiline Hill, in a narrow house that looked down upon the busy streets below. When the morning light slid through his shutters, it carried with it the murmur of vendors, the clatter of bronze pots, and the cries of water sellers weaving through the crowd. But inside his home, there was silence. A silence made not of emptiness, but of concentration. Jars lined the shelves, glass, clay, and bronze. Some held dried rosemary, bay, and fennel. Others, stranger things, powdered bone, crushed shells from the coast of Brundisium, a dark resin said to come from the east. The air shimmered with the scent of myrrh and vinegar. On the table, a bronze scalpel glinted in the sunlight like a fragment of fire. Marcus always began his day before dawn. He would light a small oil lamp, mutter a quiet invocation to Aesculapius, the god of healing, and wash his hands in a basin of cold water steeped with mint leaves. He didn't always believe in the gods, not truly, but it was unwise to tempt them. In Rome, faith and medicine walked side by side, and to ignore one was to risk losing both. He had learned his art in Alexandria, many years before, under the marble gaze of statues whose eyes had long since seen more than any man. There, he had held the first human heart in his hands, trembling, cold, still. He had watched the strange machinery of life unravel, thread by thread, and he never forgot it. Now, back in Rome, he saw the same fragility in every face he treated. The baker with a fever, the soldier with a torn arm, the slave coughing up blood in the night. Each of them a mystery he could not fully solve, but would never stop trying to. That morning, the city was already restless. A new shipment of grain had arrived from Egypt, and the docks were overflowing with shouting men, the smell of wet rope, and the cries of gulls. But Marcus's mind was elsewhere. A messenger had come at dawn, a boy no older than 12, barefoot, panting from the climb up the hill. He carried a wax tablet sealed with a red string, a summons. A merchant's wife had fallen ill during the night. Fever, convulsions, sweating. The family feared poison, perhaps from bad wine, perhaps from envy. In Rome, illness was rarely just illness. Every sickness had a story behind it, a curse, a betrayal, a punishment from a god forgotten or offended. Marcus gathered his satchel, the leather soft and cracked from years of use, and checked his tools one last time. A scalpel, a bronze probe, a small spoon for ointments. A few glass vials filled with infusions, one of poppy, one of honey and vinegar, one of wormwood. He wrapped them carefully in linen and stepped out into the blinding sun. The streets of Rome were alive. The smell of bread baking, the chatter of women at the fountain, the distant rumble of chariots on the cobblestones. Children ran past, chasing a stray dog. Somewhere, a priest was chanting, his voice deep and rhythmic, calling upon Jupiter to bless the harvest. And through it all, Marcus moved quietly, his cloak drawn close, the satchel heavy at his side. He often thought of how little people truly understood about their own bodies. They believed sickness came from the air, the miasma, the bad breath of the gods, or from demons that slipped into the body while one slept. Sometimes they were right. The air of Rome could make a man sick faster than a knife could cut him. But Marcus had seen other truths, the way a wound festered when left unwashed, how the color of blood could reveal whether a man would live or die. He had no word for bacteria, no name for infection. Yet his instincts told him that filth, not fate, often killed. He reached the merchant's house, where the doors stood open and the servants were whispering prayers under their breath. Inside, the air was heavy with incense. The woman lay on a couch, pale and trembling, her lips cracked from thirst. Beside her bed burned a small lamp, and at its base, a small clay figurine of a god, its face rubbed smooth by desperate fingers. Marcus knelt beside her. He touched her wrist. The skin was burning, the pulse weak. He asked what she had eaten, what she had drunk, how the illness began. Her husband, a man with rings thick as grapes, answered in broken bursts of Latin and fear. Poison, he said. He was sure of it. His wife had enemies. Someone had cursed her. Marcus nodded, though he knew better. The sickness was likely from spoiled grain, or from water drawn too close to the sewers. But he didn't argue. He could never win such arguments, not against fear, not against faith. Instead, he opened his satchel and began to work. He mixed honey and vinegar with powdered rue and placed it gently on the woman's tongue. He cooled her forehead with a cloth soaked in mint water. And then, as was custom, he whispered a charm, not because he believed, but because they did. Chalice, guardian of life, turn away the evil wind. May her breath return, may her blood cool. Outside, the city roared on. But inside that room, there was only the quiet sound of a man fighting against the invisible. It was always that way. For every cure he knew, there were 10 he did not. And as the day faded and the lamps were lit, Marcus sat by her side, wondering as he always did, why do some live, and others fall away like smoke? Is it skill, or luck, or the will of something greater? That night, as he walked home beneath the amber glow of torches, he passed the temple of Aesculapius. From within came the sound of soft chanting and the faint clatter of offerings. He paused, and for a moment, the scent of herbs and smoke surrounded him, the same smell that lived in his own home. He closed his eyes. The next morning came quietly, though in Rome, quiet never lasted long. The sun climbed through a pale sky, brushing the tiled rooftops with gold. Somewhere down the street, a rooster crowed, late and uncertain. The air smelled of smoke, olives, and iron, the smell of the forges that never slept. Marcus woke before the city did. He sat by the small window in his upper room, grinding dried poppy heads into a soft gray powder. The pestle moved slowly in his hand, the sound soft and rhythmic, almost like breathing. He had not slept well. The merchant's wife had lived through the night, but barely. And he knew that if she died, her family would not blame disease or misfortune. They would blame him. In Rome, healers stood on the edge of reverence and danger. A single failed cure could undo years of quiet work. One unlucky death could turn neighbors into accusers. It had happened before, a physician beaten in the street, another driven from the city after a noble's son died of fever. Healing was a craft balanced on the edge of fear. As Marcus set aside his mortar, there came a knock. Slow, heavy, the sound of someone carrying weight. When he opened the door, 2 men stood before him. Soldiers. The first, broad and scarred, leaned on the other's shoulder, his arm bound with a strip of linen already dark with blood. They smelled of sweat, leather, and dust from the training fields beyond the city walls. "Physician," said the uninjured man, bowing his head. He was wounded in practice. The blade went too deep. Marcus gestured them inside. "Lay him down here," he said quietly, motioning toward a low couch near the hearth. The soldier winced as he moved, the muscles in his jaw tightening. When Marcus unwrapped the linen, he saw a gash across the man's forearm. Long, deep, raw. Blood oozed slowly, dark and steady. It was not fatal yet, but infection would come quickly if it wasn't treated. He reached for a bronze basin and poured wine into it. Cheap, sour wine, the kind used only for washing. The soldier stiffened. "Wine," he muttered. Marcus nodded. "It burns," he said, "but it cleans." The man gave a half-smile. "So do the gods," he said, and clenched his teeth. As Marcus poured the wine over the wound, the soldier hissed in pain. The liquid ran crimson down his arm, dripping onto the floor. Marcus worked calmly, methodically, pressing the edges of the wound together, binding them with a strip of wool soaked in vinegar and honey. Honey, he had learned long ago, kept the rot away. No one knew why, but it worked, and that was enough. When it was done, he gave the man a small cup. "Drink," Marcus said. "What is it?" "Poppy mixed with wine. You'll sleep without dreams." The soldier drank it in one swallow. His friend watched, crossing himself in the old way, 2 fingers to the forehead, the heart, the air. "Does it always work?" he asked quietly. Marcus looked up from his tools. "Nothing always works," he said. "Not medicine, not prayers. But both help." The man nodded slowly. "He believes Mars watches him," he said. "That's why he's alive. The others, they think wounds are punishment. From the gods. For pride." Marcus said nothing. He had heard it 1,000 times, that pain was divine justice, that fever was penance, that plague was the gods' breath upon the city. But he had seen children die who had done nothing wrong, and thieves live long enough to grow old. If there were gods behind all this, they were strange ones indeed. As he cleaned his instruments, he glanced toward the shelf where his amulets hung, little charms of bone and bronze, each carved with a symbol. He kept them not for belief, but for protection of another kind. Patience trusted a man more when he honored the old ways. To heal in Rome, you had to heal not only the body, but the fear that clung to it. He remembered an old saying from Alexandria: "The doctor heals by hand, the priest by word, but both by faith." He had laughed at it once. Now he wasn't so sure. By afternoon, the soldier was sleeping. Marcus sat by the open doorway, looking down at the street below. A group of children were playing with wooden sticks, pretending to be gladiators. They shouted the names of famous fighters, swinging invisible swords at the air. He watched them for a long while, his thoughts drifting. He had treated real gladiators before, men with scars layered like tree rings, each one a story of survival. He remembered how they stared at their wounds as if looking into mirrors of their own lives. Some wore amulets carved with images of Hercules or Mars. Others wore none at all, believing only in strength. But every one of them, sooner or later, came to him with fear in their eyes. Not of pain, but of dying unseen. That fear was something Marcus understood. In a city as vast as Rome, men vanished like dust on the wind. A single fever could erase a name from memory. A wound could silence a story forever. He often wondered if his work, these jars, these herbs, these stitched cuts, truly fought against death, or only delayed it long enough to give meaning to the delay itself. Outside, the sun began to lower, painting the walls with amber light. From somewhere nearby came the slow toll of a temple bell. The scent of burning offerings drifted through the streets, cedarwood, fat, incense. It mingled with the smell of vinegar and iron from his own hands, forming a strange harmony of life and ritual. The soldier stirred and opened his eyes. Marcus leaned closer. "You'll live," he said simply. The man smiled faintly. "Then I'll pray for you," he whispered. Marcus hesitated. "To whom?" "To all of them," the man murmured, closing his eyes again. "Whichever God listens first." Later, when the soldiers had gone, Marcus washed the floor with water and vinegar until the last traces of blood were gone. He stood at the threshold of his home, watching the evening descend upon the city. The sound of prayers echoed faintly from the temple of Aesculapius on the hill. He bowed his head, not in devotion, but in weariness. Tomorrow, someone else would knock. A fevered child, a wounded worker, perhaps a noble with a poisoned heart. The faces changed, but the questions never did. Where does illness come from? Why must it choose us? And why, in all his years of healing, had Marcus never found an answer that felt complete? He closed the door, lit a single lamp, and sat beside his table. The flame wavered in the draught, making the jars on his shelves gleam like small stars. He thought of blood, how it carried life, how it betrayed the dying, how it always told the truth. And then he thought of belief, how it carried hope, how it blinded and protected at the same time. Morning in Rome began with sound. Before the first rays of sunlight reached the marble columns or the tiled rooftops, the city was already alive, with voices, footsteps, and the endless creak of wooden carts. The streets smelled of bread, olive oil, and dust. Pigeons fluttered over the roofs, their wings scattering grains from the previous day's market. And beneath that familiar chaos, there was the rhythm of daily survival, the slow, breathing pulse of an empire that never truly slept. Marcus Aurelius Licinius stepped into the narrow street with his satchel over his shoulder and his hood pulled low against the morning glare. He was heading toward the Forum Holatorium, the great market of herbs and vegetables, a place where healers, fortune-tellers, and frauds stood side by side, their voices blending into a strange song of persuasion and promise. He liked the market least in the mornings. It was too loud, too eager, too full of people who believed they knew what healing meant. Yet, it was where he had to go. The small jars in his workshop were nearly empty. He needed dried sage, vinegar, honey, and crushed myrtle leaves. And somewhere among the stalls, a man named Crispus would be waiting, a dealer of herbs, relics, and, depending on the day, trouble. The market spread before him like a living map of color and smell. There were baskets of figs, onions, and garlic piled high beside trays of dried fish and bowls of salt. A woman sold perfumes from Egypt, their scent thick and musky, almost too rich for the air. Near her, an old man sat on the ground with a cage of snakes, claiming that their shed skin could cure fever if worn beneath the tunic. Marcus passed him without slowing. The people here believed in everything. That rosemary brought memory, that mint drove away evil spirits, that the smoke of laurel leaves could protect a child from death. He had learned never to mock such faith. Belief, he had come to understand, was its own kind of medicine, and sometimes it worked when nothing else could. Crispus's stall was tucked behind a line of spice merchants, half hidden by hanging bundles of thyme and sage. The man himself stood behind the counter, short and round, with a face like a weathered walnut and eyes that missed nothing. When he saw Marcus, he grinned. "Ah, my learned friend returns," he said, spreading his arms. "Looking for real medicine today, or for miracles?" "Whichever is cheaper," Marcus replied, setting down his satchel. Crispus laughed, the sound sharp as breaking clay. He reached under the counter and produced a jar of dried poppy heads. "Alexandrian," he said proudly. "Very strong. Good for pain. Or for forgetting." Marcus inspected them closely, crushing one between his fingers. The scent was right, earthy, heavy, clean. He nodded. How much? For you, physician, a small fortune. Marcus sighed and handed over a few silver coins. You charge more every season. I charge what life is worth, Crispus said. And in Rome, life grows expensive. They continued their ritual of trade, herbs for coins, remedies for silence. Around them, the market surged and shifted like a tide. A boy shouted about amulets that could drive away the night sickness. A woman with painted eyes offered charms shaped like small hands, claiming they had been blessed by a priest of Isis. The air shimmered with the heat of too many torches, too many bodies pressed close. Marcus gathered what he needed: sage, rue, vinegar, and a small pouch of powdered charcoal, when a soft voice spoke from behind him. Physician, please. He turned. A woman stood there, her face veiled, her hands clasped tightly around a small bundle. Her eyes were wide and red-rimmed from crying. My son, she whispered. He's burning with fever. He says the spirits are in his blood. The priest says it's punishment. But I don't know which god I've angered. Please, you must help. Marcus looked at her bundle, a small boy wrapped in a thin cloth. His face was pale, his lips cracked, and his breath came in short, shallow gasps. He touched the boy's forehead, hot as coals. Where do you live? He asked. Across the river, she said. Near the old mills. We have nothing but. He raised a hand. You have what matters. Crispus watched in silence as Marcus drew a small vial from his satchel and poured a few drops of poppy into the boy's mouth. Then he unwrapped a handful of dried mint and crushed it between his palms, letting the mother inhale its scent. It will not cure him, Marcus said softly, but it will calm him. Bring him to my house before sunset. The fever must be watched. The woman nodded, tears glimmering in her eyes. The gods bless you, healer. When she was gone, Crispus leaned closer, his voice low. You should charge for such kindness. The poor pay with gratitude, and gratitude fills no belly. Marcus smiled faintly. Some debts aren't meant to be paid. Crispus grunted. Then you'll die poor. Perhaps, Marcus said, gathering his herbs. But not forgotten. As he turned to leave, his eye caught something strange, a small clay tablet hanging from a nearby stall, etched with an image of a serpent coiled around a staff. The mark of Aesculapius. It was cracked, the paint faded, but it drew his gaze all the same. He bought it without asking why and tucked it into his satchel. Perhaps it was superstition, or perhaps something quieter. The comfort of a symbol that had watched over healers since before Rome had walls. The streets grew hotter as the day wore on. The shouts of merchants blurred into one endless chant. Children chased each other through clouds of spice dust. Marcus walked slowly, feeling the weight of the clay charm pressing against his side. He thought of the boy by the river, of the woman's trembling hands, of the merchant's wife still hovering between life and death. In the end, he realized, Rome itself was a kind of patient, vast, restless, and sick in ways no physician could truly cure. Its fever burned through wars and prayers alike. And yet, somehow, it lived on. When Marcus reached his home, the sun was already falling behind the hills, and the air had turned the color of bronze. He unpacked his satchel and laid out the herbs on the table one by one. For a long while, he simply watched the lamp flame flicker over them. Small, fragile lives, each with its own secret, each with its own power. Then he reached into the bag and pulled out the clay tablet. He hung it by the window, where the evening light touched it gently. The serpent's shape glimmered faintly in the last rays of sun, winding its way around the staff like a whisper of eternity. Night had already settled over Rome when Marcus found himself unable to sleep. The air was warm and heavy, carrying the distant scent of smoke and sea salt from the harbor. Outside, the voices of the city faded slowly into silence, a rare silence, as if even Rome needed to breathe between its endless days. He sat at his table, the oil lamp burning low, its flame bending in the draught. The light trembled over the clay tablet he had bought that morning, casting the shadow of the serpent and staff onto the wall. It twisted, alive, and for a moment it looked almost real, as if the ancient god of healing were watching him through the wavering glow. Marcus turned away. His hands rested on the table, palms up, stained faintly with wine and poppy oil. He looked at them, these hands that had stitched wounds, eased fevers, and sometimes failed. The thought came quietly, uninvited, as it often did. How much do these hands truly know? It was then his mind wandered back to Alexandria, the place where his knowledge began, and where he first learned what fear truly meant. He had been a young man then, barely 20, full of certainty and hunger for understanding. Alexandria was a city of wonder, brighter and stranger than Rome. The air was saltier, the light sharper. The streets smelled of incense and the sea. Greek, Egyptian, Latin, and Hebrew voices mingled like the notes of a broken song. And rising above them all was the library, that vast temple of learning whose walls glowed in the sunlight like the skin of a pearl. He remembered the day he first stepped inside. Rows upon rows of scrolls, their edges browned with age, the air thick with dust and ink. There were men there who spoke of medicine not as an art of gods, but as a study of nature. Men who dared to say that illness was not divine punishment, but the failure of balance within the body. Words that in Rome might be whispered in private were spoken aloud there, beside the marble statues of Aesculapius and Isis alike. And yet, even in Alexandria, there were boundaries. Some knowledge was not to be spoken of. Not in daylight, not before witnesses. The living body was sacred, yes, but the dead one, they said, was dangerous. To touch it, to open it, was to walk in the shadow of blasphemy. Still, Marcus remembered the night he crossed that line. It was late, the torches burning low in the courtyard of the medical school. A handful of students gathered there, led by an older physician, a man named Herophilus, gray-bearded, with eyes that burned with restless curiosity. He was one of those who believed that to understand life, one must first look death in the face. "Do not look away," Herophilus had said, his voice low but steady. "What you see here will offend your heart, but it will teach your mind." They stood before a stone table. Upon it lay the body of a man, a criminal, executed days before. The air was thick with salt and oil meant to hide the smell. Someone whispered a prayer. Marcus did not. He felt his hands tremble as the knife descended. He could still hear the faint scrape of metal on bone. He remembered the way the chest opened like a secret, not divine, not mystical, just matter. And yet, in that matter, there was something holy. Veins that carried rivers of life, lungs soft as clay, a heart that once beat like a drum beneath the ribs. When the knife touched the heart, Herophilus spoke again. "Here," he said, "is the seat of the soul." He pressed his fingers to the muscle, still moist. "And yet," he added softly, "when it stops, the man is gone. Tell me, then, what left him?" No one answered. Not Marcus, not any of the trembling students standing beside him. Because what had left the man, whatever it was, could not be found with a blade. That night, Marcus could not eat. He sat alone by the harbor, staring at the black water and its reflections of the moon. He felt both enlightened and haunted, as if knowledge itself carried a curse. He understood things now that others feared to imagine. Yet in understanding, he felt farther from peace. Years later, in Rome, that same unease followed him still. Every time he stitched flesh, every time he watched the color fade from a dying face, he thought of that table in Alexandria, of the way truth and horror had been one and the same. He had come to realize something. Fear was not the enemy of knowledge. It was its shadow, and those who learned to walk beside it, not to deny it, not to flee from it, were the ones who truly understood what healing meant. The lamp beside him flickered. Its flame leaned low, then straightened again, as if breathing. Marcus exhaled, slow and tired. He reached for the clay serpent on the wall, tracing the smooth, cool line of its body with one finger. In the silence of his room, he whispered to no one in particular. We learn so much about the body, and so little about the soul. Outside, the wind stirred the olive trees, carrying the distant sounds of Rome, laughter, footsteps, the clink of amphorae, the low hum of the living. Life, pulsing endlessly beyond his walls. Marcus closed his eyes and finally allowed himself to rest. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new fevers, new faces filled with hope and fear. And though he no longer prayed as he once did, he still kept the serpent by his bed, not for faith, but as a reminder of what he had seen in Alexandria, and of what all healers must face before they can truly begin to heal, the anatomy of fear itself. Not the usual smell of Rome, not the wet clay after rain, nor the smoke of hearths and olive oil lamps, nor even the rot of the Tiber when the summer heat grew too heavy. This was something different. It crept into the narrow alleys like a stranger in disguise, faint at first, almost easy to ignore, a sweet, sickly odor that clung to the air and refused to leave. Marcus noticed it before anyone spoke of illness. He thought it was perhaps a problem with the drainage behind the fish market, or a rotting shipment from Ostia. But within a week, the patients began to come, one after another. Faces pale, eyes glazed, their breath hot and shallow, their bodies trembling as if the very blood within them had turned against itself. They came to him at all hours. Some carried amulets of bronze and coral, others brought offerings, eggs, bread, honey, hoping his skill was tied to divine favor. They spoke of curses, of foul air rising from the ground, of punishment sent by the gods for sins unnamed. And Marcus listened, because that was his duty. But inside, he felt the quiet dread that comes when reason no longer has an answer. He had seen sickness before, fevers from the marshes, wounds gone black with infection, soldiers brought home from the east with strange rashes that bloomed like dark flowers. But this was different. The speed of it, the violence of it, the way the body seemed to collapse in on itself, as though life were being drawn away by invisible hands. One evening, a messenger arrived from the Subura, the crowded heart of Rome, where thousands lived stacked upon each other, where disease spread faster than gossip. They brought word that dozens had fallen ill overnight. By dawn, it was hundreds. By the next sunset, the carts began to roll. Marcus walked to the Subura himself. He needed to see. He could not trust rumor. The narrow streets were thick with noise and heat. People shouted from windows, others carried buckets of water, some prayed in doorways until their voices cracked. And in the midst of it all, the smell, stronger now, heavy and unmistakable, clung to everything like oil. It was the scent of decay before death, of the body unraveling from within. He followed the sound of coughing into a small courtyard, where a woman sat beside her son. The boy could not have been more than 10. His skin was ashen, his lips cracked, his neck swollen with dark lumps that pulsed faintly beneath the surface. His mother looked at Marcus with hollow eyes. She did not ask if he could help. She only said, "Tell me how long." Marcus knelt beside the child, pressed 2 fingers to his wrist. The pulse was fast, then faint, then fast again. The boy's breath came in shallow bursts, each one wetter than the last. He mixed vinegar with water and sponged the boy's forehead. He crushed dried fig with honey and poppy to ease the pain. He whispered calm words, not prayers, just sound, the rhythm of a healer who has seen too much. But he knew already. He knew this was something beyond his craft. Something that would not yield to herbs or will. When the boy's chest stopped moving, Marcus sat in silence. The mother's cry broke through the courtyard like a blade. He bowed his head, feeling the weight of every failure that had come before and every one that would follow. That night, he returned to his home by the Tiber and wrote by lamplight. He recorded symptoms, durations, patterns. He marked where the sick lived, near the river, near the baths, near the markets. He noted how the illness spread faster in the heat. He wrote that the swellings appeared first in the neck and groin, followed by fever, delirium, and death within 3 days. And then, at the bottom of the wax tablet, he wrote a single line. We do not yet know whether the gods have done this, or we ourselves. Over the next weeks, the city changed. Public fountains grew silent. Baths closed their doors. Even temples stood empty, priests afraid to touch the offerings left by trembling hands. The laughter of taverns vanished. The markets echoed only with the creak of wooden carts carrying the dead through the streets. Some physicians fled the city, seeking safety in the countryside. Others stayed, more out of guilt than courage. Marcus stayed too, because where would he go? If knowledge could not defend a man from fear, then at least he could stand beside it. He began to wear a strip of linen soaked in wine around his mouth and nose. He burned herbs in his home, rosemary, laurel, myrrh, not because he believed it would help, but because the smoke reminded him he was still alive. Each day he walked through the streets with his satchel of tools, knives, clamps, poultices, jars of oil and honey. He no longer counted the patients. He stopped asking names. He simply worked, wiping, cutting, binding, listening. The city of marble had turned into a city of whispers and mourning. And yet, even then, there were small moments that refused to die. A woman singing softly to her husband as he slipped into sleep. Children running in the alleys, unaware of how fragile their laughter was. The baker who still rose before dawn, baking loaves no one dared to buy, leaving them at the doors of the sick. One night, after tending to a soldier who coughed blood into his hands, Marcus washed in the Tiber. The moon reflected off the slow water, pale as bone. He looked at his reflection and thought, perhaps this is the true test of the healer, not to cure, but to remain human when surrounded by death. When he returned home, he found a small parchment left at his door, sealed with wax. It bore the mark of the Senate. Inside was a summons. All remaining physicians were to gather at dawn, in the Forum of Peace. The emperor himself had ordered council. Marcus stared at the message in the dim light, the wax seal trembling in his fingers. It had been years since the emperor took notice of men like him. If even the palace was summoning physicians now, then perhaps the plague had reached the marble halls as well. He sat down, the night pressing close around him. The flame of his lamp shivered. He closed his eyes and whispered, not to any god, but to the memory of the boy in the courtyard. If I cannot save you, may I at least learn from you. Outside, the city of Rome lay sleepless. And somewhere in the darkness, the plague continued its silent march, patient, unseen, unstoppable. Dawn came pale and thin, as if even the sun feared to rise over Rome. Mist clung to the rooftops, curling around the statues and columns like faint, ghostly breath. The streets were nearly silent, the kind of silence that does not comfort but warns, as though the city itself were holding its breath. Marcus walked through it slowly, his satchel slung over his shoulder, the Senate summons folded inside his cloak. Every step echoed against the paving stones. He passed doors marked with chalk, the symbols of sickness drawn by trembling hands, circles, crosses, and words that pleaded for divine mercy. From one open window drifted the low murmur of prayer, from another the ragged cough of someone already lost. As he neared the Forum of Peace, he saw them, the other physicians. A dozen men in worn tunics, their faces gray with fatigue and fear. Some he recognized from the temples and baths, others from the poorer districts. They stood in uneasy silence before the great marble gates of the Domus Augustana, where the emperor's messengers waited. "Marcus of the Aventine?" one of them asked. He nodded. "Come then. The emperor's court awaits." They entered through corridors lined with columns and mosaics of gods whose eyes had long ago lost their shine. Incense burned heavily in the air, thick enough to make one dizzy. Servants moved quietly, their faces hidden behind cloths soaked in perfume. Even here, in the heart of Roman power, the smell of sickness could not be kept out. At last they were led into a vast hall of marble and gold, the Aula Regia. Sunlight filtered through veiled windows, painting the floor with pale ribbons of light. And upon a raised dais, half hidden behind draped curtains, sat the emperor. Commodus. He was younger than Marcus expected, broad-shouldered, his face both beautiful and cruel, like a statue carved too perfectly. He did not wear armor, only a white tunic embroidered with the golden serpent of Aesculapius. His hands were restless, drumming on the armrest of his chair. When he spoke, his voice was calm but sharp, the kind of voice that left no room for silence. "You are the physicians of Rome," he said. "You serve the city, and by extension, you serve me. The people whisper of a curse, of punishment. I say it is ignorance that spreads faster than disease." He gestured toward a table beside him. Upon it lay a small boy, motionless. A prince, perhaps, or a noble child. His skin was pale, his breathing faint. At his side stood a woman, the empress herself, her eyes red from sleepless nights. Marcus felt the familiar pull of dread and duty. He stepped forward, bowing slightly. The emperor's gaze followed him like a blade. "Tell me," Commodus said, "what afflicts him?" Marcus knelt beside the boy. He touched the pulse, the skin, the swollen nodes at the neck. He listened to the shallow breath, the faint rattle in the chest. He knew the signs too well now. "Fever," Marcus said softly. "The same that walks the streets beyond these walls." The empress's lips trembled. Commodus's hand tightened on the armrest. "You will cure him," the emperor said. It was not a command, but a sentence, one that allowed no reply. Marcus hesitated. "I will try, Caesar. But this illness, it does not respect walls or wealth." The emperor's eyes narrowed. "You speak as though even my blood can be touched." Marcus met his gaze. "Even the gods are touched, Caesar, when Rome forgets how to care for its own." A silence followed, so deep Marcus could hear the rustle of the silk curtains. One of the courtiers shifted uneasily, and then, to his surprise, Commodus laughed, low and bitter. "You are braver than most who stand before me," he said. "Or perhaps too tired to fear death." He gestured again to the boy. "Do what must be done. If the gods favor you, Rome will sing your name. If not, well, the city already has too many ghosts." Marcus bowed his head and began. He mixed vinegar with wine, crushed figs and myrrh, soaked linen in oil, and placed cool cloths on the child's brow. He burned herbs beside the bed, their smoke curling like whispers toward the ceiling. Hours passed, or perhaps only moments, before the boy's breathing eased, just slightly, like a tide pulling back from the shore. When Marcus finally rose, his knees ached, his back stiffened. The emperor watched him closely. "Will he live?" Commodus asked. "I do not know," Marcus replied truthfully. "But I believe he will not die tonight." The emperor nodded once. "Then you will stay here until you are sure. Rome will reward those who serve her, and remember those who fail her." He dismissed the court with a wave of his hand. As the others bowed and retreated, Marcus remained, feeling the strange weight of being both needed and expendable. That night, he was given a room within the palace, simple but silent, overlooking the gardens where peacocks wandered under the moonlight. He did not sleep. He sat by the window, watching the mist roll in over the rooftops. Below, he could see the city, torches flickering, streets half empty, shadows crossing the bridges of the Tiber. He thought of the poor in the Subura, the dying in the temples, the mothers burying their children without ceremony. And now here he was, inside marble walls, tending to an emperor's son while Rome rotted in silence. He wondered if healing one life could ever balance the weight of so many lost. He doubted it. But he also knew that to stop trying was to surrender entirely. From the darkness came the faint hoot of an owl, a sound Romans often took as a bad omen. Marcus smiled faintly. "Not an omen," he whispered to himself. "Just another creature awake when others sleep." The flame of the lamp trembled, and in it he saw his reflection. Weary eyes, hands still stained with wine and blood. The hands of a man who had seen too much to believe in miracles, and yet still reached for them. He would stay, for now, in the emperor's house, among marble and silence. But he knew already, the true sickness of Rome was not in the lungs or blood. It was in the soul of the city itself. And no medicine could cure that. Nights in the imperial palace had their own kind of silence. Not peaceful, but heavy, deliberate. A silence that listened. A silence that hid things. Marcus soon learned that sound traveled strangely here. A whisper in one corridor could drift through another like a ghost. Footsteps echoed from unseen places, and behind every curtain, he suspected, stood a servant pretending not to hear. The marble walls gleamed under the torchlight, but the air was thick, thick with incense, thick with secrets. He had been there for 3 days. The boy still lived. The fever had not worsened, though neither had it passed. Marcus visited him each morning, changing the cloths, whispering words meant to soothe, mixing new drafts of herbs and honey. The empress watched silently, her eyes swollen from tears she no longer shed. She asked no questions. She did not need to. At night, Marcus roamed the corridors, unable to sleep. He watched the servants move like shadows, carrying bowls of smoking herbs from room to room. He caught glimpses of the imperial priests, old men in white robes, sprinkling salt on the thresholds, drawing chalk symbols he had not seen since his days in Alexandria. There was fear here, too, though gilded and perfumed. The same fear that stalked the poor in the Subura, only quieter. On the 4th night, as he sat alone in the courtyard by a fountain, he was joined by a man he did not recognize. The stranger wore a dark toga, plain but finely woven. His hair was silver, his face lined, his eyes quick. "You are Marcus of the Aventine," the man said, not asking but stating. "I am," Marcus replied cautiously. The man smiled faintly. "I have read your notes. The emperor's steward brought them to me. You write with clarity, and without superstition. That is refreshing. And you are Lucius Petronius, once a physician, now something less noble, an advisor." Marcus studied him. There was something familiar in his bearing, the calm of one who has stood beside too many sickbeds and learned the limits of prayer. Lucius leaned closer. You should know, Marcus, the emperor listens to many voices. Not all of them speak of medicine. I've noticed, Marcus said. Good. Then you will also have noticed the priests. I have. They tell Commodus that the fever is punishment, a curse born of neglecting the old gods. They urge him to make offerings, to sacrifice in secret. He listens, for now. But when his patience ends, he will need someone else to blame. Marcus's eyes narrowed. And that someone will be us. Lucius nodded slowly. The healer always stands between the living and the dying. If he saves, he is praised. If he fails, he is feared. Rome is no different now than it was in the time of the plague at Athens. The people will demand a cause, and causes are dangerous things. The fountain gurgled softly, its water reflecting the trembling light of the torches. Marcus stared into it, watching the ripples. He thought of the boy, still asleep in the upper chamber, of the people beyond the walls, dying nameless in the streets. Why tell me this? Marcus asked. Lucius gave a thin smile. Because I've seen good men destroyed by their own honesty. You are a man of reason, Marcus. Reason does not fare well when fear governs Rome. He rose, his cloak brushing the marble floor. Be cautious. Speak softly. And remember, in this palace, even truth must wear a disguise. Then he was gone, leaving Marcus with only the sound of the fountain and the faint rustle of wind through the olive trees. That night, as Marcus returned to his chamber, he noticed something strange. At the far end of the corridor stood a door he had not seen before. Narrow, half hidden behind a tapestry depicting Apollo healing the sick. A thin line of light glowed from beneath it. Curiosity whispered to him, the way it always had. He hesitated, then stepped closer. From inside came a murmur, a voice chanting, rhythmic, low. He recognized no words, only the cadence of ritual. Then, the sound of metal, a blade perhaps, and the faint scent of burnt myrrh. He pushed the door open a little, just enough to see. Inside, a group of priests stood around a low table. On the table lay the figure of a lamb, blood dripping into a bronze bowl. They whispered prayers to Apollo, to Aesculapius, to any god who might still be listening. At the head of the table stood a tall man in crimson robes, face hidden beneath a hood. In his hands he held a serpent carved from ivory. Marcus's stomach turned. He had seen enough blood to be unmoved by sacrifice, but this was something else. They were trying to summon healing through fear, to force the divine hand by offering life for life. The tall man raised his head slightly, and for an instant, his gaze met Marcus's through the crack in the door. The eyes beneath the hood were sharp, human, and aware. Marcus stepped back quickly, his heart pounding. He turned and walked away, keeping his pace steady until the corridor bent out of sight. He did not sleep that night. By morning, the fever in the emperor's son had worsened. The empress wept silently at his side. The emperor, pale and sleepless, ordered more priests into the palace. The air filled with smoke and prayer and desperation. Marcus tried everything, the poultices, the herbs, the wine, the baths. But the boy's skin burned hotter each hour, and his breathing grew shallow. At dusk, Commodus stood over him. Tell me, he said softly, if he dies, what shall I tell Rome? That even the gods are powerless. Marcus met his eyes. No, he said. Tell them the gods gave us minds, and we chose to stop using them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the emperor turned away. Careful, physician, he murmured. Words like that can make even truth sound like treason. Marcus bowed his head, though his jaw tightened. When he left the chamber, He passed Lucius in the corridor. The old advisor gave him a knowing look. "Now you see," Lucius said quietly. "The palace has more sickness than any street in Rome. Only here, it is called faith." That night, as thunder rolled over the hills beyond the city, Marcus stood by the window and watched lightning cut across the sky. The storm swept through the air like a cleansing breath, but he knew it would not reach deep enough to wash away what had settled in the heart of Rome. And somewhere beyond those walls, in the crowded quarters by the river, the plague continued its silent work, indifferent to emperors, priests, and prayers alike. The days that followed were long, heavy with the stench of incense, sweat, and sickness. The emperor's son remained fevered, his body taut with pain, and the palace had grown colder in tone, as though shadows had crept through the halls and refused to leave. Marcus moved through it all, silent, steady, performing the same rituals he had performed hundreds of times before. Poultices of figs and myrrh, cloths soaked in wine and vinegar, gentle sponging of skin blistered with heat. Yet every action now carried weight beyond the patient's life. Each touch was scrutinized, each word weighed. It was the priests who made it unbearable. Every morning, Marcus was summoned to their private chambers. They whispered of sins, of divine punishment, of the impiety of relying on flesh and reason instead of the God's mercy. One priest, an old man with fingers like gnarled roots, told him that his hands were too bold, too curious, and that by dissecting the dead in Alexandria, Marcus had opened a door that should remain closed. "You have angered them," the priest said, his voice like dry leaves. "And now their wrath walks in the streets." Marcus wanted to speak, to explain, to argue, but he knew words were powerless here. Faith, especially fear-born faith, was stronger than reason. He had seen it in Alexandria, and now again in Rome. Men willing to die or to kill for what they believed, no matter the truth before their eyes. Late one evening, as the rain hammered the marble roof, he was summoned again. This time by Commodus himself. The emperor's son slept fitfully, his small body shivering beneath blankets soaked with fever sweat. The empress watched in silence, her eyes heavy with despair. "Marcus," Commodus said, pacing before the bed, "the priests claim you bring impiety into this house, that your methods mock the gods." He stopped and looked down at Marcus, eyes dark with worry and authority. "You are my healer, and yet they say you are dangerous. Tell me, is this true?" Marcus swallowed. "The boy's life rests not on prayer alone, Caesar," he said. "It rests on knowledge, patience, and care. I honor the gods in my way, through service, through preservation of life. I do not seek to mock them, only to aid their creation." The emperor's jaw tightened. "Then they are your enemies," he said quietly. "And you, mine." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "I am yours, as long as life is yours to command." Commodus said nothing more, but the tension in the room lingered. Later, when Marcus left, he walked the corridors and felt eyes following him. Whispers trailed behind like shadows. "Heretic, impious, the boy may die by his hand." He returned to his chambers and unrolled a scroll from Alexandria, its edges brittle and ink faded. It contained illustrations, sketches of human anatomy, notes on pulse, breathing, and disease. He had studied them obsessively, memorized every line, every observation. It was knowledge the priests claimed was forbidden. And yet, it was the only thing standing between him and failure. As he worked, he realized something he had known but never named. Rome feared what it did not understand. The poor blamed their sickness on curses, the nobles on divine retribution, and the priests on the arrogance of men who dared to look inside the body. And Marcus, who carried that forbidden knowledge, had become the fulcrum upon which all their fear balanced. That night, a servant arrived with a message. one of the priests demanded a private audience. He would not say which. Marcus understood without asking. They intended to confront him, to bind him with words, to break him with threats. He prepared himself as he always did, gathering herbs, checking his tools, reviewing every note he had ever taken on fever, infection, and blood. He lit a single lamp, its flame steady against the draft, and waited. The door opened slowly. A man entered, hooded, robes trailing behind him like smoke. He carried a staff carved with symbols Marcus did not recognize, symbols older than Rome, perhaps older than even Alexandria. "You study the dead," the man said, voice low, cold. "You touch what should not be touched. You violate the natural order. You bring knowledge that men were never meant to hold." Marcus did not flinch. "I do what I must to save life. If that offends your gods, then perhaps they need better servants." The man's eyes flared. "You mock them." "No," Marcus said softly. "I honor life. That is all." The priest's lips twisted in anger, but he said nothing more. Instead, he dropped a small bundle on the table before Marcus. Inside was a tiny figurine, carved from bone, depicting a human figure with ribs exaggerated, hollowed eyes, and a serpent coiled around its heart. "You will place this at the bedside of the sick," the man said. "Pray to it, or they will die. And if they do, know that the gods have judged you." Marcus looked at the figurine, cold and silent. He understood the threat. Not merely superstition, coercion, politics, fear wrapped in faith. If he failed to obey, he would be blamed. If he obeyed, he would still be watched. He took the figurine, hiding the resentment that rose like fire in his chest. "Tonight, it will lie beside the boy," he said quietly. "Tomorrow, we will see if knowledge or fear governs life." As the priest left, the wind rattled the shutters. Marcus sat alone, the lamp flickering over scrolls, jars, and tools. Outside, the storm continued, rain lashing against the marble walls, thunder rolling like drums of war. He touched the figurine, tracing the coil of the serpent. He thought of the boys and girls, the men and women, dying unseen in the city beyond the palace. He thought of Alexandria, of what he had learned, and what Rome now demanded. And he realized, with a quiet certainty, that the greatest danger to a healer was never the sickness of the body, but the sickness of fear itself. He placed the figurine by the bed of the emperor's son, its hollow eyes reflecting the lamplight. He whispered to it, not in prayer, but in promise. "I will do all I can. Not for you, not for them, but for life itself." And somewhere beyond the palace, in the misted streets of Rome, the plague moved on, indifferent to gods, emperors, and heretics alike. The Subura was alive with whispers long before the sun rose. Even through the early morning fog, Marcus could hear the soft murmur of prayers, the coughs of the sick, and the quiet footsteps of those too fearful or too poor to leave their homes. From the palace, the city below seemed distant, a mosaic of rooftops and smoke. But when he descended, he stepped into a different world, one raw and unshielded from the plague. Narrow streets wound between crowded tenements, walls dark with mold and soot. Children ran barefoot over stones slick with morning dew and filth. Women leaned out of windows, offering water to those below, their eyes hollow but determined. Everywhere Marcus looked, there were bodies pressed close together, some leaning, some sprawled, some too weak to call for help. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, decay, and fear, an odor that clung to the lungs and made the head swim. He moved quietly, blending with the crowds. No one recognized him here, no gold thread on his tunic, no imperial seal. He was simply a man with a satchel and a purpose. He stopped at a small courtyard where the sick were gathered, sitting on mats and crates. A thin boy coughed violently, clutching at his chest. A woman pressed a cloth to his forehead, rocking him gently. Marcus knelt beside them. "Let me help," he said softly. They looked at him with wary eyes, suspicion mingled with hope. He opened his satchel and pulled out a small jar of crushed figs mixed with honey and wine. He applied it to the boy's mouth and gently massaged his temples with a cloth soaked in vinegar and myrrh. "You are not a priest," the woman said, her voice trembling. "No," Marcus replied. "I am a healer. I see what the body can do, and I do what I can." 4 hours, he moved from one patient to another, adjusting poultices, cleaning wounds, applying cooling cloths to burning skin. He took notes in his wax tablet, observations about fever, respiration, skin discoloration, and the patterns he had begun to notice from the emperor's son. He compared the symptoms: swollen necks, hot skin, delirium, sudden collapse. Each patient told a story. Some whispered of spirits, others of curses, a few mentioned a sudden wind or shadow that had passed over their homes. By midday, Marcus found himself outside a collapsed tenement. A man lay on the steps, barely breathing, eyes wide with fever and panic. He knelt, examining the body, noting the pulse and temperature. The man's breath rattled, and Marcus realized that without intervention, he would not live through the day. He poured wine mixed with crushed herbs between the man's lips, applied cooling cloths, and massaged the pulse. Hours later, the fever began to lessen, just enough to allow shallow sleep. Marcus stepped back and allowed himself a small, quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes not from pride, but from knowing that a life had been prolonged, if only slightly. Whispers spread among the residents. "He is a healer," one child said. "He can touch the fever," murmured another. Marcus kept moving, silent, aware that too much attention could bring the priests down upon him, or worse, draw the emperor's scrutiny in a way that could compromise his work. As evening fell, the Subura was darker, heavier. Candles flickered in windows, casting long shadows that danced like spirits on the walls. Marcus climbed to a rooftop and looked out over the district. The streets were narrow ribbons of life and death intertwined. He thought of the emperor's son, the palace, and the city beyond. The plague did not discriminate. It swept through wealth and poverty alike, indifferent to prayer, gold, or blood sacrifice. He returned to the palace that night, exhausted but resolute. He wrote notes by lamplight, cross-referencing the symptoms he had seen in the Subura with those of the imperial boy. Patterns emerged, faint and troubling, suggesting a speed and virulence beyond what Rome had known before. Yet Marcus knew he had glimpsed something vital, that the knowledge gleaned from the streets, the crowded quarters, and the forgotten alleys could inform his care, perhaps even save lives. And for the first time, he considered a dangerous possibility: treatments the priests would call heretical, methods that would push the boundaries of both medicine and superstition. Outside, the city slept fitfully. The Tiber reflected the moonlight in patches, silver and dark. Somewhere, a child cried. Somewhere else, a mother prayed aloud for mercy. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He understood now that the healer's path was not only in skill, but in courage. The courage to face not just sickness, but fear, ignorance, and the shadows that lingered in the hearts of men. And he knew that tomorrow, he would descend into the Subura again. Because life, in all its fragile insistence, demanded it. Marcus returned to the palace with a mind restless, hands aching from the day's work. The emperor's son lay asleep in the upper chamber, blankets damp with sweat, fever still tugging at his small body. The air smelled of myrrh, wine, and fear. He set his satchel down, brushing dust from the cloths, and unrolled the scrolls from Alexandria. Every line, every diagram, every marginal note called to him, urging him to remember what he had learned and to act beyond the restrictions imposed by Rome's priests. He knew the risk. The priests would denounce him if they discovered what he was about to do. They would claim impiety, heresy, or worse. And the emperor, though favoring him so far, might turn if he felt threatened by his own healer's knowledge. Yet Marcus understood a principle he had carried since those nights in Alexandria. The mind that learns and the hands that heal are obligated to act, even when danger lurks. He began with poultices enhanced with herbs rarely used in Rome, crushed willow bark, poppy seeds, rue, and the powdered root of mandrake, all mixed with honey and wine. He applied them cautiously, first to the boy's forehead, temples, and the swollen patches along his neck. He whispered the old names of herbs he had memorized: salix, papaver, ruta. Words of science, not prayer. The boy stirred, groaned softly, and Marcus allowed himself a quiet hope. Next, he moved to more daring treatments. He prepared a mild bleed, using the method Herophilus had taught him in Alexandria, carefully letting a few drops of blood escape from the boy's arm to ease the pressure of fever. He balanced it with cold compresses, sponging the body in vinegar and water, cooling the skin while maintaining warmth in the extremities. The instruments he used were polished and sharp, familiar from decades of practice, yet they carried a weight of fear now amplified by politics and superstition. Late that night, a messenger arrived with news from the Subura. A young woman had given birth amidst the plague, her child weak, trembling, eyes glassy. The local midwife had refused to touch it, claiming the gods had forsaken the poor. Marcus read the note, then set it aside. He had no permission to leave the palace. But permission was often irrelevant in emergencies. He gathered what he could carry: jars of herbs, linen, small tools, and left by a back door, moving through corridors lit only by torchlight. Even the servants whispered as he passed, some in awe, some in fear. They knew the healer was leaving without leave. They did not ask where he went. In the streets of the Subura, darkness enveloped him. The narrow alleys twisted, carrying the stench of rot and sweat. Marcus navigated by memory, pausing only when the shadows seemed to press too close. At last, he reached the mother and child. The woman, haggard from labor and fever, looked at him as if seeing an angel and a devil at once. "Will you help?" she asked. "I will," Marcus said. "And perhaps that is enough." He worked quickly, applying mild herbal tonics to the infant, massaging its chest, and carefully cleaning the mother's wounds. He whispered lessons learned from Alexandria, gentle manipulations to ease breathing, cooling compresses to moderate fever, subtle balancing of diet and fluids. Hours passed. He did not rest. He could feel the weight of the city pressing in, each cough, each groan, each whisper of the plague reminding him that he was only one man in a storm. By dawn, the infant's breathing steadied, the mother slept in brief intervals, and Marcus stepped back, exhaustion weighing on his limbs. He did not smile. He did not allow himself triumph. He only noted carefully in his tablet what had worked, what had failed, what might be tried next. When he returned to the palace, he knew he had crossed a line. The priest's eyes would have fallen on him if they had known. And yet, he had learned something essential. Sometimes, the act of healing must defy fear itself. In the days that followed, he continued to experiment, adjusting herbal mixtures, carefully balancing heat and cold, observing subtle changes in pulse, breath, and skin. He began to see patterns emerge in the plague's behavior: which patients succumbed quickly, which lingered, which responded to care. Every small success was a defiance against the shadow of superstition that suffocated the city. Yet Marcus understood the truth that always lingered behind his work: knowledge without caution could be deadly. One mistake, one poorly timed remedy, and a life could be lost. And with it, his position, his freedom, perhaps even his life. Still, he pressed on. because to watch Rome fall to ignorance while he held the keys to understanding, even in part, was a fate worse than any threat from priests or emperors. At night, when the palace lay silent, he studied the scrolls, reviewed his notes, and plotted the next move. He understood now that the healer's path was not simply tending to the sick, but navigating the delicate, perilous space between science and fear, between knowledge and power. And he knew that every night, every street, every patient in the Subura was a reminder. Rome's survival depended not on prayer alone, but on those brave enough to act where fear whispered to hide. Outside, the moon rose pale over the city. Somewhere, a child's cry broke the stillness. Marcus listened, heart steady, hands ready, and he knew that tomorrow he would descend into the Subura again, forbidden remedies in hand, defiance in his mind, and the relentless hope that life could yet be preserved. The emperor sat in his private chamber, staring at the city from tall, veiled windows. Commodus had grown restless in recent days. The fever in his son had begun to ease, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, yet enough to stir a dangerous thought in the young ruler's mind. The priests, with their folded hands and solemn warnings, had claimed dominion over life itself, that only the gods could sway fate. But Marcus had proven otherwise, and Commodus could not ignore it. He summoned the physician to his side, pacing the marble floor. The boy, his son, still slept fitfully upstairs, fever breaking in small, uneven waves. "Marcus," the emperor began, voice measured but carrying a tension that betrayed his uncertainty. "Tell me, is this your doing?" Marcus knelt before the chair, careful to keep his posture low yet respectful. "I have applied remedies, Caesar. Herbs, cooling compresses, and careful observation. Nothing miraculous. Only careful attention and knowledge." Commodus leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "The priests would say it is blasphemy to act thus, that you have challenged the gods. And yet, the boy lives." "Yes, Caesar," Marcus said. "And only because Rome allows me the freedom to act where fear and superstition have failed." The emperor's hands clenched. He had been raised to believe in divine right, to trust the priests, to see the world through a lens of omen and sacrifice. And yet, here was proof that the human mind could shape outcomes that once seemed predetermined. It unsettled him, though he could not admit it aloud. "They say," Commodus said slowly, "that the plague is a punishment, that it walks among the city to teach humility, to remind men of their place before the gods." He paused, looking down at his hands. Perhaps the gods are not as absolute as they claim. Perhaps knowledge itself is a power, Marcus, one that can rival their will." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. The emperor's doubt was a fragile thing, easily swayed back by priests or fear, but it opened a door nonetheless. "Knowledge is a tool, Caesar," he said quietly. "It does not replace caution, faith, or respect, but it can save life where fear and superstition would only prolong suffering." The emperor considered this, pacing again. "And the priests?" he asked finally. "Do they fear this truth?" Marcus nodded. "They fear what cannot be controlled, Caesar. And knowledge cannot be cajoled or commanded. It must be understood, observed, and applied. And that frightens them." Commodus sighed, a sound of weariness that no one in the palace had ever heard from him. He had seen the Subura, had glimpsed the suffering beyond the marble walls. He had watched Marcus descend into those alleys and return, carrying life in his hands. The contrast between fear and courage, ignorance and skill, unsettled the young emperor. "Very well," Commodus said at last. "You will continue your work." He hesitated, then added quietly, "But know this, should the priests turn against you, I must know your loyalty. Do you serve me, Marcus?" or only the city? Marcus bowed, choosing his words with care. I serve life, Caesar, and in serving life, I serve Rome, and you, as its ruler, are bound to it. The emperor studied him, eyes dark, searching. Then he nodded once. Then continue. I will bear the anger of priests if they dare rise against you. For now, your wisdom is the only shield this boy has. When Marcus left the chamber, the air in the palace seemed lighter, though he knew it was only temporary. Suspicion could return with a whisper, a glance, or a single misinterpreted action. Yet for the first time, he sensed a fragile alignment between his skill and the favor of power. That evening, he descended once more into the Subura. He moved quickly through alleys thick with shadows, the stench of illness heavy in the air. He treated the sick where the priests would not, whispering quietly to children and mothers, guiding breaths, applying poultices, observing subtle changes in skin, pulse, and breathing. The people began to recognize him, a silent figure of knowledge and defiance, a man who moved among death yet brought hope. Whispers followed him through the streets. Healer. He knows. He can touch the fever. Some crossed themselves, fearing impiety, yet others offered small thanks, gifts and water, trusting the one who worked miracles in secret. Marcus returned to the palace at night, exhausted, hands raw from work, but determined. He understood the precarious balance, the emperor's favor, the priest's suspicion, the ever-present plague. And he knew that each night, each patient, each secret journey into the Subura strengthened both his skill and the danger surrounding him. He gazed out at Rome, the Tiber reflecting pale light like a river of silver threads through darkness. The city was alive, fearful and fragile, and in his hands rested a small measure of control. The plague had not yet been conquered, but knowledge, courage, and careful defiance could push the balance toward life, if only just enough to matter. The palace was quieter than usual that morning, but quiet in Rome rarely meant safety. Marcus moved through the halls, satchel in hand, listening to the faint creak of marble underfoot and the distant echoes of servants and guards. Something unsettled him, a whisper of unease that had nothing to do with the fevered boy upstairs. When he entered the chamber, the emperor's son was awake, restless, his small body burning with the remnants of fever. The empress hovered near the bed, eyes red-rimmed, her hands folded tightly. Commodus, pacing near the window, stopped as Marcus approached. "Tell me," the empress said, voice low, "have the priests brought any new counsel?" Marcus hesitated. "They suggest stronger intervention, Caesar. Blood sacrifices, amulets, rituals. None are needed, and some may harm." Commodus's brow furrowed. "They speak of curses, of wrath. Yet the boy improves under your care. Tell me, Marcus, how long can I trust them? And you?" Marcus said nothing at first, noting the boy's pulse and temperature. Then, quietly, "Trust is measured in deeds, Caesar, not words. The priests speak in fear. I act in observation." The emperor's eyes darkened. "Then watch carefully today. Watch your cup." Marcus followed his gaze. On the table, beside the small bowl of wine meant for the boy, rested a silver chalice, polished and gleaming. Something in the air told him to be wary. Intuition honed by years among the sick, the dying, and the fearful. As he bent over the boy to check his pulse, Marcus's hands froze. A shadow moved in the corner of the chamber, too quick for a servant, too deliberate for coincidence. He straightened subtly, eyes scanning the room, and saw the edge of a folded piece of parchment beside the chalice, the kind scribbled in hurried hands, steeped in threat. He realized the danger instantly. The priests had taken it further than warnings and whispered curses. They had prepared a test, or a trap. The wine could be poisoned, either with herbs designed to mimic illness or with something more deadly. He reached for the chalice with care, sliding it aside and examining it. No visible markings, no scent, nothing to betray it to the untrained eye. But Marcus had trained in Alexandria. He remembered the subtle signs, faint residue, odd weight, even the way light caught on the metal surface. It was enough. He poured the wine into a separate cup and added a drop of crushed herb from his satchel, a simple reagent that would reveal bitter traces of poison. The liquid changed slightly, a faint darkening, confirming his suspicion. Commodus, standing near the window, caught the movement. "What is it?" Marcus held the cup carefully. "A test, Caesar. A chalice meant to harm. It is poisoned." The emperor's eyes widened, then narrowed with fury. "By the gods, the priests? How dare they? They fear the power of knowledge, Caesar. They fear that one man's hands, guided by reason, can rival their influence over life and death." Commodus moved swiftly, summoning guards and demanding a list of all priests in the palace. Marcus stepped back, knowing that open confrontation could be as dangerous as the plague itself. He kept his voice quiet. "Careful, Caesar. Anger in a house so full of fear can be as deadly as any disease." The boy stirred, sensing the tension, and Marcus returned to him, checking his pulse, gently cooling his forehead. The empress watched, silent, her face taut with worry and relief. By nightfall, the chalice incident had forced a subtle shift in the palace. The emperor's doubt had hardened into suspicion. Suspicion of the priests, yes, but also a guarded respect for Marcus. He had seen the truth. Knowledge could save, but it could also provoke envy, fear, and hatred. Marcus, meanwhile, returned to his scrolls and jars, his hands unsteady but determined. The threat had reminded him that medicine in Rome was never just about healing the body. It was a game of observation, strategy, and courage. Every remedy applied, every step taken, carried weight not just for the patient, but for the healer, for the emperor, and for the city itself. Outside, the Subura slept in uneasy silence. The plague moved on, ignorant of palaces, poisoned chalices, and imperial intrigue. And Marcus, weary but unbroken, understood more than ever that the greatest danger in Rome was not the fever that consumed the flesh, but the fear and superstition that consumed the living. Marcus moved through the city as if guided by the pulse of Rome itself. The plague was no longer an invisible enemy confined to whispers. It had a pattern, a rhythm, a shadow that stretched across streets, through alleys, and into the palaces. He traced it carefully, noting where it struck first, which households reported the sick earliest, and which families seemed inexplicably spared. Even the emperor's son could not escape its reach entirely. The fever had relented, yet Marcus noticed subtle fluctuations that suggested a latent danger, as if the illness were gathering strength for another strike. He returned frequently to the Subura, observing the people, listening to their whispered accounts, taking meticulous notes. Some families hid their sick, fearing public shame or divine retribution. Others fled their homes entirely, leaving possessions behind, hoping the city's walls would shield them from disease. Children wandered barefoot, coughing, and yet laughing, unaware of the danger, their tiny bodies vulnerable yet stubbornly alive. In the palace, Marcus continued his careful ministrations. He watched the boy closely, charting pulse, skin color, and breathing. He compared these signs with those he observed in the Subura, searching for hidden connections, something that would allow him to anticipate the fever's movements before it struck anew. Patterns emerged. The fever struck fastest where ventilation was poor, where water was stagnant, and where fear prevented care. It spread silently through neglect, superstition, and the crowded streets where life and death were pressed so closely together that neither could move freely. Late one evening, Marcus was summoned to the emperor's study. Commodus, unusually silent, gestured him forward. "My son rests," he said, "but I have begun to see the truth in your work. This plague, it moves like a shadow. I can feel it even within these walls. Tell me, Marcus, can it be stopped?" Marcus studied the young emperor, noting the exhaustion, the tension, the fragile hope. "Caesar, it cannot be stopped completely. Disease is as old as the city itself. But it can be slowed, mitigated, its victims reduced. Care, observation, and understanding are our only weapons." Commodus nodded slowly, pacing. "Then we must learn its patterns. You have eyes I do not. Show me." That night, Marcus unrolled his scrolls and tablets, showing maps of the city with marks indicating outbreaks, minor clusters, and the trajectories he had begun to observe. He traced paths from the Subura to the Aventine, noting how the illness seemed to flow like water, pooling where the population was dense, trickling through the streets, following commerce, neglect, and fear alike. Commodus leaned closer, intrigued despite himself. "So it is not divine punishment," he said slowly. "Not entirely. Not entirely," Marcus repeated. "It is human failure as much as anything else, neglect, ignorance, fear, and the natural course of disease." The emperor's expression darkened. "Then the priests, they have lied or misled. They have spun what they can," Marcus said gently. "But Rome is alive, and in its living, we can find our path to preservation." Outside, the Tiber reflected the pale moonlight, winding through the city like a river of silver shadow. The Subura slept uneasily, the fog curling in the alleys, the scent of smoke and illness lingering. Marcus gazed down from the palace, feeling the weight of his work, the fragile line between knowledge and superstition, life and death. He realized that the plague had revealed more than just illness. It had exposed the city's weaknesses, in its fear, its neglect, its belief in powers it could neither see nor control. He returned to the emperor's son, adjusting compresses, checking the pulse, noting subtle changes in the child's condition. Each flicker of fever, each shadow of weakness, was a clue, a message from the disease itself. And Marcus, guided by both observation and courage, would read those signs carefully, navigating the delicate balance between healing and danger. As dawn broke over Rome, a faint breeze swept through the palace gardens, carrying the smell of olive trees, wet earth, and faint smoke. Marcus stood at the window, studying the city below. The plague's shadow stretched wide, yet so did his resolve. He understood that knowledge, courage, and relentless observation were as vital as any potion, herb, or ritual. Rome's survival depended on it, and on him. He whispered quietly to himself, as if speaking to the city itself. "Step by step, breath by breath, we will endure. And perhaps, through understanding, we will triumph where fear alone would fail." Marcus realized that the palace, though protective, was also a cage. He could care for the emperor's son here, but the city's fever pulsed beyond these walls, and knowledge alone could not cross the threshold without risk. He needed a place where observation could merge with action, where remedies could be tested, measured, and refined in secrecy. Thus, he began searching for a hidden space, somewhere the priests could not easily enter, and where his work could proceed without interference. In a small, forgotten chamber beneath the palace, once a storage room for wines and olive jars, Marcus found the perfect site. The air was cool and dry, the walls unadorned, the floor solid. With care, he cleared the space, laying down mats, jars, and clean cloths. He brought herbs, tinctures, and small instruments, arranging them meticulously on a low table. Every tool had a purpose, every substance, a history steeped in centuries of observation from Alexandria and beyond. He worked late into the night, candles flickering, shadows dancing on the stone walls. His hands moved with practiced precision, crushing herbs, blending tinctures, preparing poultices and decoctions. Here, he was free. Free to apply knowledge without fear of censure, free to observe reactions, free to experiment. And yet, he remained cautious. Even in this hidden lab, one mistake could be fatal, not only to his subjects but to himself. The first patient he brought was a child from the Subura, whose fever had resisted simpler remedies. Marcus applied a carefully measured poultice, administered a mild herbal tonic, and monitored the pulse. He adjusted compresses to cool without shock, balanced hydration, and observed breathing patterns with meticulous attention. Hours passed. The child's breathing eased, fever diminished slightly, and Marcus noted every subtle improvement. He allowed himself a brief sigh of satisfaction, a reminder that his methods, though forbidden, could save lives. Word began to spread quietly among the Subura's people. They whispered of a healer in the palace, a man who moved like a shadow through alleys, who brought relief where others despaired. Some feared him, calling him a sorcerer. Others trusted him, offering food, small gifts, and protection from the watchful eyes of priests. Marcus accepted nothing but information, symptoms, observations, and the subtle ways disease revealed itself in flesh and blood. As days passed, Marcus refined his methods. He began cataloging symptoms more systematically, noting which combinations of herbs, cooling techniques, and hydration brought relief. He observed patterns, how some families seemed resilient, how certain foods or water sources influenced recovery, and how the disease spread through densely packed streets. It was painstaking work, and isolation was essential. A single discovery exposed to the wrong eyes could undo months of careful observation. One night, while studying a patient whose fever fluctuated wildly, Marcus noticed a subtle detail, a small rash on the inner wrist, nearly invisible, that preceded spikes in temperature. He documented it immediately, understanding that such patterns might allow him to anticipate the plague's movements, and perhaps even save the lives of others before the illness took hold. But the secrecy weighed heavily. He could not share his findings openly with the palace physicians or the emperor's court. The priests would denounce him, and fear would follow. He worked alone, relying on intuition, experience, and knowledge gleaned from distant lands. Every success was measured not in praise, but in the quiet relief of those who would live another day. Outside, the city continued its slow, uneasy rhythm. Children coughed in narrow alleys, merchants hurried past closed doors, mothers prayed quietly by their sickbeds. The plague moved like a shadow, indifferent, relentless. And Marcus, in his secret lab, began to understand that to fight it successfully, he would need more than skill. He would need courage, cunning, and the unwavering will to act where others hesitated. That night, he paused, gazing at the faint flicker of torchlight through a tiny window high on the wall. Rome slept uneasily. The plague had cast its shadow over every street, every home, every soul. And Marcus, alone in his hidden chamber, whispered softly to himself, "Knowledge is our only shield, and I will wield it, even in the dark." The palace corridors felt narrower that night, the torchlight throwing elongated shadows that seemed to slither along the walls. Marcus moved with careful steps, satchel slung across his shoulder, mind alert to every sound, every shift in the air. The secret lab had allowed him a measure of control, a space where knowledge could be applied without interference, but he now sensed that unseen eyes were watching, listening, waiting. It began subtly. A tray of herbs left in the lab appeared disturbed, jars slightly moved. Servants whispered behind closed doors, their voices dropping when Marcus entered. And then there were the notes, hastily scrawled on scraps of parchment and left where he would find them, messages filled with veiled threats and warnings. Do not meddle in what is not yours. The gods see all. So do we. Marcus understood immediately. The priests had realized the threat he posed, that his forbidden knowledge and successful remedies undermined their authority. They had begun to weave their influence quietly, hoping to remove him from the palace before he could solidify the emperor's trust. He moved cautiously through the hallways that night, listening for whispers, watching for shadowed figures. The servants were loyal, but loyalty in Rome was often fragile. Fear could turn devotion into betrayal. He paused near the empress' chambers, hearing faint murmurs, voices speaking in low tones, careful not to be overheard. He did not need to hear every word. The intent was clear. The priests feared him, feared the truth he carried, and feared losing their grip on power within the palace. Marcus returned to his lab, heart pounding but resolve firm. He examined every tool, every potion, ensuring that his remedies could not be tampered with. Each step he took had to be precise. The stakes were no longer merely medical, but political. The emperor's son depended on his vigilance, and now Marcus realized that life itself was entwined with the shadows of intrigue that moved silently through the palace. He began keeping detailed notes, not only of his treatments and observations, but of the subtle signs of interference and conspiracy. Which doors were left unlocked? Which servants appeared nervous? Which jars were slightly moved? The plague might kill the body, but these human shadows threatened his mission in ways far more insidious. Late that night, a small figure appeared at the lab door, one of the palace pages, eyes wide with fear. You must be careful, sir," the boy whispered. "The priests, they are watching. They do not trust you, and some would see harm come to the boy." Marcus nodded, heart tightening. "I understand," he said. "You will tell no one. Trust only what you see, hear only what you must. Do you understand?" The boy nodded solemnly and slipped away into the shadows. Marcus realized he could trust only a handful, perhaps no one, but the danger had sharpened his focus. Every herb, every compress, every observation was now conducted under the threat of human malice as much as disease. By morning, he had decided on a plan. He would continue his work openly with the emperor's son, where Commodus could observe every success, while fortifying the secret lab, hiding his most advanced remedies, and documenting the priest's movements. He would use discretion, patience, and careful strategy to protect both life and knowledge. As he descended to the Subura later that day, Marcus noticed subtle signs in the alleys: mothers who watched him cautiously, children who hid in corners, whispers that carried warnings he could not fully decipher. The plague was no longer his only enemy. He now navigated a city where shadows whispered not just of fever, but of human fear, envy, and power. At night, he returned to the lab and studied the emperor's son, noting subtle improvements, but never allowing relief to dull his vigilance. The whispers of the priests persisted in the background, a constant reminder that knowledge, however potent, must always be guarded. And Marcus, alone among candles and scrolls, understood that mastery of disease would demand mastery of secrets as well. For the plague was merciless, but human intrigue could be just as deadly. He lit a single lamp, tracing the lines of his notes, murmuring softly, "Shadow and fever move alike, unseen, relentless. But so do we, if we are careful, patient, and courageous." The palace slept around him, unaware of the invisible battle unfolding in its quiet halls, between fear and knowledge, faith and reason, shadow and healer. And Marcus, with the weight of the city's life pressing on him, prepared for what he knew would come, challenges far more dangerous than fever alone. The morning air in the palace was thick with tension, though no one could see it except Marcus. The servants moved cautiously, eyes darting to corners and hallways, murmuring under their breath, while the priests whispered prayers that felt more like curses than blessings. Marcus sensed a shift, subtle but undeniable, as if the shadows themselves had grown bolder overnight. When he entered the emperor's son's chamber, he noticed immediately that something was amiss. The blankets had been rearranged, not by his careful hands, but with a hasty, unpracticed touch. A tray of herbs had been moved slightly, and the cooling compresses were damped beyond what he had left them. He froze, scanning the room. The boy stirred, weak but alive, sensing the tension, his small hand twitching reflexively. Marcus knelt and inspected the instruments, the satchels, the jars. Nothing was overtly tampered with, but subtle signs, a faint residue here, a slight imbalance there, confirmed his suspicion. The priests had acted. They had attempted to interfere, to undo his work, to demonstrate that human skill could never triumph over divine authority. He moved quickly, replacing compresses, adjusting poultices, carefully administering tonics that he knew would stabilize the fever. Every action was deliberate, precise, a battle of attention against the invisible threat. His heart pounded, not with fear of disease, but with the knowledge that human hands, guided by envy and superstition, could be as lethal as the plague itself. Later, in the secret lab, Marcus reviewed the situation. He found evidence that confirmed his suspicions. A small scrap of parchment with faint writing, hurriedly discarded, left behind by a priest or servant coerced into betrayal. It warned of the heretic healer, whose hands were too bold, whose knowledge too dangerous, and whose success must be undone at any cost. Marcus understood the stakes now more clearly than ever. The priests were not merely observers of fate, they were actors in it, attempting to manipulate events according to their fears, their beliefs, and their desire to maintain authority. And he, the healer, stood directly in their path. He devised a careful plan. He would continue his work with the emperor's son, openly and with the full knowledge of Commodus, who had begun to question the priest's motives. At the same time, he would fortify his secret lab, hiding the most delicate remedies, the experiments most likely to provoke suspicion or envy. And he would observe, quietly, patiently, relentlessly, to uncover the priest's methods, their alliances, their weaknesses. That evening, he ventured once more into the Subura. The alleys were thick with fog and fear, the air pungent with the odor of illness and decay. He moved from home to home, treating fevered bodies, adjusting poultices, administering tonics, and documenting the patterns he saw. The people whispered his name cautiously, some in awe, others in suspicion, but all relied on his skill in a way that transcended fear. By the time he returned to the palace, night had fallen completely, casting long shadows through the halls. He checked the emperor's son again, noting improvement in breathing, pulse, and skin temperature. It was a small victory, but vital, proof that careful observation and skill could counter not just disease, but interference from those who sought to control life through fear. Marcus sat alone in the lab, the flicker of candlelight reflecting in jars, scrolls, and instruments. He realized that the battle ahead would not be fought solely with herbs, tonics, and compresses. It would be fought with strategy, discretion, courage, and the unyielding application of knowledge in the face of fear, superstition, and human malice. Outside, Rome slept uneasily, the fog wrapping the city like a living thing. The plague moved on, indifferent to priests, emperors, and healers alike. And Marcus, alone in the flickering light of his secret lab, whispered softly, "Shadow and fever are relentless, but so is knowledge. And as long as we move carefully, life will have a chance." He knew the priests would not relent. They would strike again, and perhaps more boldly. But Marcus, guided by observation, courage, and the relentless pursuit of life, was ready to meet them. For the city, the emperor's son, and the countless unseen sufferers of Rome, failure was not an option.